Šiandien mes tęsime gilinimąsi į internetizuotos visuomenės charakteristikas per meninės priemonės, dėmesį sutelkdami į kūno ir interneto santykį. Mūsų svečias šiandien yra Dovydas Laurinaitis, tarpdisciplininis menininkas ir tyrėjas, kuris savo praktikose gilinasi į internetu medijuojamų socialinių santykių problematiką. Tai jo projektas Jungti, apie kurį ir šiandien nemažai kalbėsime, eksperimentuoja su būdais kurti autentišką kūnišką ryšį su tarp žmonių internetu. Vienas jo projektų tai nuolatinis performansų ritualas Speak lietuviškai, kalba apie Dovydo tarptautinę lietuvio brito tapatybę, buvimą pusiaukelėje tarp užsieniečio ir vietinio, apie patogumą ir nepatogumą kalboje ir Kauno mieste. Dėl šitų priežasčių nagrinėjama Speak lietuviškai performance. Šios transliacijos metu su Dovydu kalbėsimės anglų kalba. So now we switch to English. So to the English speakers who might have not understood what I just said, today we're talking with Dovydas Laurinaitis, who is an interdisciplinary artist and researcher who delves into the issues of online mediated social relations. So to start with, let's talk about Jungti. We know well that one of your projects is called that way, Jungti, and it's a net.art piece investigating digitized social practices and ways to create authentic and meaningful bodily connections between people online by overcoming some digital distances. So could you tell us more about this project and what are the main topics of it?
Sure. So first of all, thank you, Ugna and Geetas, for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk about internet art and about my projects. So I think to understand how I got to Jungti, it's important to kind of go back a bit. So the Jungti project, it's not just me, it's a collaboration between myself and artist Iga Maria Stepanska, and we work together under the name of Novikalba. And we actually began our collaboration in late 2017, and it began with an exploration of the performative aspects of media. Now, I don't call myself an internet artist. As you said, I'm an interdisciplinary artist, and I tend to work with digital mediums in some of my work, amongst other tools such as performance, language, collectivity, ritual, and so on. So we began to investigate this idea of, can a recording be a performance? Because typically we think of recordings as being dead in a way. They happened, and what you're watching is a documentation of something that happened. You're not witnessing the actual event. And we were really curious, well, can you actually have a recording that is the performance, not a documentation of it? Of course, this is an unsurmountable task. It's an unachievable goal, and actually that is what drives our practice, unachievable goals, such as having bodily connections through the internet. So when we talk about how documents can perform liveness, I want to show a bit of our research. So, well, research and also artists before us who have already played with this. So Geetas, if you could just show the video from Tony Ausler. So Tony Ausler is a multimedia artist, and he works with projection mapping on sculptures. And seeing this was really inspirational to me because it showed the way that you can take a recording, which is done, and then give it a new life by positioning it in a certain way, by framing it in a certain way. And then another example, and I did say in an Instagram story that I will explain what the link between Tony Ausler and the rapstress Azealia Banks is. And another example from sort of mainstream culture is Azealia Banks' 2016 music video for Wallace, on which she collaborated with Google to create a music video that was interactive. And the viewer would have to have the camera on, and their movements would change how Azealia responds and how the video looks. So it was really playing a lot with how can one person's presence make an artwork, because each person would have a completely different artwork experience. And another example that I want to show. I'm just going to share my screen quickly, is the example of Katie Mitchell. So bear with me for one moment. Okay. So what you should hopefully be seeing, if I minimize this Skype page. So this is the performance of La Milady de la Mort, and I butchered the French, and that's okay. And it is an example of Katie Mitchell's work with live cinema. So she's a really famous director in the UK, really influential, and she pioneered this approach of having a theater show that is filmed live and is also screened live. So as you can see in the photo, you have the action happening on the stage here. And then at the same time, you have a film crew that is filming, editing the footage. There's a narrator who is adding more information over the top. And it creates this multimedia viewing experience where you have the real and the mediatized colliding in the same space. So again, it shows how this recording can be enlivened by the way that we use it and what we put it in conversation with. So this led us to our experimental short film / performance in digital space, Nożycki, which in Polish means scissors. And Gitas, if you could show the video. So in this short film, we played a lot with how the different actions that we devised and recorded could be incorporated in this medium, and how could we overcome these barriers to liveness. And part of this was playing with the presence of the different recordings. So for example, what you can see is the way that my movement in the recording is affecting the way that the recording is moving on the screen. This is, in particular, is an action that I did for 30 minutes. I was skipping rope for 30 minutes, and it begins at the beginning of the film and it disappears, but it continues in the background. So you have all these clips that are somehow existing in this black space and emerging out, coming back in, and it very much was an attempt to try and find a way that this recording could seem to have a life of its own. And we played a lot with the way that the viewer watches it. We had very strict instructions for how someone should watch it, without headphones, without pausing, with certain subtitles and so on. So if you have a chance, obviously check it out. So yeah, Gitas, you can turn off this example now. So what we learned from Nożycki is that this liveness is something that we can also bring to the internet, which is what led us to the Jungte project. So Jungte is a huge, long-lasting project because, of course, it's an unachievable or seemingly unachievable goal, which is very creatively stimulating. And through that project, we have a series of experiments. Right now, we have done 3. Jungte experiment number 1, 3, and 4. The second one was cancelled due to Corona, but we still are going to do it. So, which is why the numbering is a bit off. And we are planning now the 5th one. And ultimately, from those experiments, we are extracting different methodologies of how people can have a bodily connection with each other through the internet by using different tools such as text in Jungte experiment number 3 or sound in Jungte experiment number 4 and amongst others. And those experiments then get filtered into the platform Jungte.net, which is both an exhibition of our work, a living artwork, because it's going to keep being updated as we are developing more experiments. And it's a space in which we use what we found to allow people to try and have those connections. So there is a lot of reasoning behind why we decided to do this project. So particularly if we are thinking about this idea of the body of the internet. Well, this is very much related to this idea of internet transcendentalism, that somehow when you use the internet, you end up going to a virtual space where you are without body and you are kind of having this very disembodied experience. And we were very much not agreeing with that because it is a physical experience. You are touching something, you are seeing something. And this is actually a key thing about this project. We are not inventing anything new. We are reframing how we already interact with these objects, with these things, and how they interact with us. So even something as sound, as light, these are a form of touch, because the waves, the photons, they have to actually touch us in order to transmit their information. And that's really key here, this idea of touch. And a definition that we found helpful comes from the succinctly titled The National Scientific Research Center of France's Dictionary of the Body, I know, which defines touch as the action of the movement through which two bodies come into contact with one another, and membranes permit this contact. So using this definition, we started seeing the internet as a membrane network, as a type of skin, as something that we can move through to the other person on the other side of the screen. And of course, the body of the internet itself is incredibly physical. It's entirely physical. It is made up of servers and cables which stretch across the entire world, of satellites beaming waves. Again, very physical interactions happening perhaps invisibly, but nonetheless physical. And in the same way that we require energy and very specific conditions, such as temperature conditions, the internet does so as well. We have a lot in common. We are two bodies, and if we consider ourselves and the internet, we are three bodies. And the internet and the digital space is very much a collaborator with us. And a lot of this is related to sort of the philosophy of why we are doing this project, is because we became very concerned with the fact that social media platforms such as Facebook are not actually offering the opportunity to have a genuine human connection. They are offering a simulacrum of it. Now, simulacrum is an idea developed by Baudrillard, a philosopher, and it very quickly put is the idea that an image born out of a reality becomes its own reality, and therefore denatures and destabilizes the reality from which it came. So we realized that what Facebook was offering was not an actual bodily connection, and the way that Facebook is designed is in a way that it actually activates your biological responses. It activates your dopamine production through likes and scrolling, your oxytocin production, which is produced anyway whenever we are interacting with those close to us. And even some research says that when we are shown a photo of another person, because our brains are quite primitive in that way, our biology doesn't recognize that this is a photo, it's an image, it thinks that it is the real thing. So we have this social media platform that is using all of these biological mechanisms, and what do you get in the end through interacting with it? You get this simulacrum, this image of a human connection. And we started to think, well, maybe this is why we feel so shallow, we feel so empty, we feel maybe so depressed when we are using these social media platforms. So with Unity, we thought, okay, well, how can we then take these mechanisms and use them to allow users to have a connection that is bodily, that is real, that is not an image, but is the reality itself, by reframing and so on.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You touched upon multiple definitive topics of internetified experience. Simulacrum is kind of main thing, and you also were speaking about the body of the internet and certain material features. It's very your metaphor of the membrane, I think, is very elaborate here and very useful, and actually very definitive of what early internet artists were trying to do. Actually to touch and to experiment with this membrane of the internet. So here I will briefly present early internet artworks to ground our ideas in historical context. Miniatures of the heroic period is one of the earliest in net art exhibitions. which was made as an ironic gesture targeted towards art, very kind of capitalistic art market. We will really be able to touch that when we start reading about sections. But what I wanted to show is actually the artwork by Alexei Shulgin. He's one of the most well-known early internet artists. And in this work, he's actually investigating the URL as a creative expression and certain material of the internet. This website allows us to explore various old websites, so it's very interesting to see it also as a tool to go back in time and see how internet looked like really like 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago. And the URL is being investigated here. You can experiment with it in the artwork. Another example is by Heath Bunting, an even more elaborate one, Own Beyond or Remain Invisible. Here he is presenting an essay which was written in a Wired magazine quite some time ago about Heath Bunting himself. Net.art, one of the definitive characteristics of net.art is firstly, it's the movement which investigates the materiality of the internet and tries to experiment with it, and the other aspect is anti-capitalism. So anti-capitalism, both anti-capitalism and experimentation with the materiality of the internet is being very, very vivid here. On the one layer of anti-capitalism, we can see how Heath Bunting, as an artist, unwillingly becomes a content generator for Wired magazine. It's a very kind of just some content for the magazine which was written about the artist, just filling the pages, and so it commodifies the artist and puts obviously certain advertisement which is useful for him, but on the other hand uses him as a commodity and as a content generator. And on the other layer, we see how language in the context of internet becomes commodified because words can be owned. Each word here is leading us to various websites and conference.com, for example, here. It's very interesting to experiment and see where this website is going to lead us. And actually, it's very interesting to know that the artwork was created when actually these domains like really.com were showing something totally else than they do now. So this work is always evolving, and it really touches very deeply upon this membrane network of the internet, how everything is connected, and the hyperlink as a certain form of expression. And going back to the concept of the exhibition itself, we can check how Heath Bunting is being presented. So just brief citation. This reflection on the commodification of social space is neither cynical nor resigned, but rather reveals an ambivalence typical of new generation of artists, in which much like a cross-section of Bunting's work in general, brief, powerful moments of agency and resistance erupt in new and unexpected forms. Own, Be Owned, or Remain Invisible is undeniably one of these eruptions in the history of net art, and thus cannot conceivably be excluded from any significant collection of cutting-edge contemporary net art. And you can buy this artwork for $1,900. So they're calling themselves heroic, like and writing these kind of very advertisements like texts. So this is just another another topic very much explored, like the anti-capitalist sentiments. One more example which I want to show also upon, which is investigating the internet materiality, like the code and text as parts of it, is by Ciro Musares' Untitled Document from 2005, which is creating these harsh textual landscapes and hyperlink labyrinths. It shows like really extremely elaborate experiments of how internet web pages can be composed. And yeah, I see it as a deconstruction of the website, of the body of the website. And it also shows the cryptic nature of the code, because the website is very cryptic. And I guess the fact that it's in Spanish and we cannot understand what it is say even adds more layers of the crypticism, if we can say it like this, and also shows the contextuality of the language, of the code and the language, spoken language in the world. And yeah, maybe the last artwork which I want to show is Floodnet by Electronic Disturbance Theater, which is very innovative. And here the internet materiality is being glitched and subversed. This artwork allows to use your computer for orchestrated DDoS attacks, denial of service attacks. Basically, by clicking this huge button, you can send a anonymous request to a certain web page, like Pentagon, and by doing that, web pages become overloaded and just crash. Or the other thing, you can send an email to a private space in the internet, your certain email boxes, and you can select various politicians here. So this is very activist kind of work, very anti-capitalist and activist. And originally it was created in support of Mexican insurgent group Zapatistas as a non-violent protest and as a conceptual artwork. And actually, it did cause a real impact. Like on 1998, September, they were managing to deliver 600,000 requests per minute to websites of Pentagon, Mexican government, and Frankfurt Stock Exchange. Even later, they released a developer kit, so you could basically write attacks for any website. So this is something what is totally like impossible now due to various legal constraints. And actually, it on the one hand, it shows how internet architecture can be circumvented and subversed and used against its own will, and it also shows how different was the internet these days, how different were the people who were using the internet. Very good example of that is Cameron's World, a website where we can see very fun extractions from proto social media GeoCities. So you can explore this website and I will show you something inside. So it's very representative of the society from these days, how people were approaching internet and what kind of connotations and what kind of possibilities that people saw in the internet. Maybe Dovydas, you have some thoughts on this early internet, but not on the art, but maybe on the society. How do you imagine internet society from these days, from early internet days?
Well, I have many thoughts on this. As I said, I'm not an internet artist, so I'm much more interested in the way that performances can take place online. And a very obvious example of this is the performance of identity that we see happening on social media profiles. But before we had social media, we had these kinds of personal homepages, which Cameron's World is a really good illustration of. And a lot of people now see these personal homepages as actually being a precursor to social media. Now, I found an article from the New York Times from November 1995. It's titled, Technology, Connections, Can Twinkies Think? And Other Ruminations on the Web as a Garbage Depository. And I would like to share a quote from this article. So, CompuServe began its homepage service at the end of November 1995. And within the first 10 days, 35,000 people downloaded the required software and 10,000 people posted new pages. Many such pages only a mother could love. Each page is an attempt to be part of the revolution while also insisting on the author's individuality. The authors fight the tide while they join in it. They mix iconoclasm with camaraderie. So in the best homepages, there is an air of complaint, a slightly bitter tone of a pioneer who has had it with urban life and wants to join the crowds online. So this is not even getting into the absolute trashing that the New York Times did on all these people who are creating personal homepages about nothing, about being bored, about their feet, about how many CDs they have, really banal and useless things, as what they said. And I mean, perhaps they are useless. Well, actually, this is a really defining feature of the early internet. It was very much useless, and therefore it was very hard to profit off of. And I'm glad you mentioned this anti-capitalist approach, because actually, if we look at the transformation of the early internet from these personal homepages, these very customizable spaces, to the homogenized profiles in which we inhabit now, what we can see is actually the enclosure of the internet by capitalism. So enclosure is the process by which something becomes a commodity in one sense. There is, this term is kind of emerging, and enclosure as a process is in opposition to the process of commoning. So the idea that there is a resource pool of containing all the creations of nature and society that we inherit jointly and freely, and that we pass on to other generations. So instead of commons, which is kind of, I guess, what the early internet was, this very shared, useless DIY space, it became enclosed by capitalism in a way that it went from something that couldn't be bought and sold into something which was very profitable. And when we talk about what is being bought and sold, well, actually, it's our presence on it. And it's being sold to advertisers, which, of course, is a truism. This we already know. And I want to just expand a bit on this idea of enclosure. So enclosure speaks about how capitalism mobilizes all kinds of configurations and significations. So, for example, how the space looks and how we think of it. For example, in the transformation of being co-creators of the internet to users, it encloses and it makes it a commodity. So enclosure can be defined as a process of erosion and a seizure of commons by spatial means. And it is key in the homogenization of space, because after all, a marketplace has to be homogenized in order to work. You cannot have billions of different marketplaces. You have to have a few where everything is the same. So as we saw the rise of tech companies, especially past the dot-com bubble, despite all the claims of competition that capitalism proposes, we actually don't live in a very competitive internet. We have a lot of tech companies who are enclosing the internet and us within it in order to commodify our presence and sell it to advertisers. And this includes Facebook's continual acquisitions of other internet spaces such as Instagram, WhatsApp, among others, this continual absorption of more and more spaces into this very homogenized whole. And what this subtle and gradual process of restricting and mediating control, and because that's what Facebook is, it's an intermediary. Whereas before you could make your own homepage, you could experiment, you could find out how it works. Now you are given a pre-prepared packet, and you just have to fill yourself in it. And what this process of mediating does is it deprives us of our agency in exchange for convenience, which of course is a capitalist strategy. And yes, it may be more convenient, but if we don't work directly with the material, we don't experience the messy and rewarding process of understanding it firsthand. And this understanding is absolutely key in shaping how we interact with it. If we don't have this understanding, then the mediator can use it to affect us without us being aware of it. So my big question of this is, okay, so we went in this transformation, but how are we actually transformed as part of it? Well, actually, the internet is just one example of the way that capitalism encloses spaces. It's not, I guess, particular in any way. It's reflective of a larger socio-economical reality. And it's part of this fatalism of capitalism that there cannot be anything outside of it. There can't be anything beyond it. And again, if we look at Facebook, it also has this same aura that, well, there's nothing that will be after Facebook. It's here to stay, and no matter how much we hate it, how much we don't want to use it, we have to use it, because if you don't use it, you will miss out on things, you will not be successful, you will not have the same reach. So it really establishes itself as a place with very little alternative. So in that same way, it has gained this kind of inescapable quality. And it's interesting that in 1995, they spoke about in this article that people are escaping urban life for the internet. Well, now people want to escape the internet. They want to detox. They want to control screen time. They want to somehow drag themselves back to physical reality. And actually, well, in this enclosure, where is there to escape? The whole point is that you are enclosed. You cannot escape. You are within the system. And with the Jungte project, that's kind of what we understood, and that's why we decided to experiment with ways to escape within the internet, to find some pockets where perhaps we could create a space, a safe space, which is somehow trying to defy these advertiser logic, this profitability logic, and create a space that really purely is not trying to sell you to someone or sell you anything. Instead, it's really just earnestly trying to offer you something. So yeah, seeing that we can't escape from the internet, we decided to see how we can escape into it. So that's very much kind of how I think of the transformation of the internet as part of this larger socio-economical reality.
I'm glad you touched on the enclosure aspect. Seemingly, internet at the first, when various geographic metaphors as ones elaborate on this atlas of cyberspace, which you can explore and find various ways how internet was visualized back in the day. It's a research project by Martin Dodge, which was finalized in 2007. So internet at first was had this image of completely like a free land, electric frontier where everything is possible, total inclusion, absolute democracy and all that. Apparently with time we realized that all of these ideas are very naive and far from reality. One of the things which also changed is the fact that at first internet was very unstable and slow. So perhaps maybe people were thinking that once we get it stable, we can totally transform our realities. Now, internet seems to be very monumental. So what do you think about this shift in our perception of the internet, of its stability?
So I think this idea of stability is, again, another simulacrum. It's this performance of being overconfident that you can't touch me. And actually, this experience is not universal, because if we look at countries and places such as Myanmar, Kashmir, Belarus, where governments actively turn off the internet and turn off these connections to prevent news from getting out, the internet is incredibly vulnerable. I think it's you just need to cut cables from Poland and Latvia to Lithuania to put Lithuania completely offline. But we don't see it that way. We see it as being omnipresent, always there, and I think it's not just a random coincidence that this kind of sense of impenetrability and it being all-powerful exists largely in capitalist societies, where we don't have the government turning off the internet on us to remind us that actually this is a very fragile thing that we have. So when we talk about the stability of the internet itself, I think a great example is whenever something goes down, like Facebook went down a couple weeks ago, I think now, and everyone was so surprised. It became such a talking point. Oh, did you hear? Where were you? Where it happened? And so on. And it's like we're confronted with this reality, but and we think it's an exception, but it actually isn't. And it's only because we have become so accustomed to this image of instead of the reality, to the simulacrum, that you can see how we have become entangled, how everything has become so complicated and not easy to discern what is actually the true nature of the internet. And when we talk more broadly about the interaction between physical space and virtual space, now we have tech companies trying to create what they call a frictionless experience. So, for example, Google is trying to make it so their assistants, there will be no delay between you asking a question and receiving an answer, because to them this distance is friction. But ultimately, you are not actually creating an experience that is direct. You are still having this intermediary layer, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to disguise it. They're trying to make it seem as if these two realities have somehow fused. And perhaps they've had. Of course, we are living in a more and more hybrid world, especially during these times, compared to how it was BC, before Corona. And it makes me think a lot about, where are we in this process of fusion? Have we already arrived there? Are we already living? Or are we reaching it? Because, of course, I mentioned earlier, we try to think about getting off the internet, somehow escaping from this. But can we, if we live in a hybrid reality, can we ever escape it? And actually, is our attempts to escape it somehow causing us to suffer, making us frustrated? Because somehow we're trying to do it, but we can't, but we don't know why. It's difficult. I don't really have such an answer to this. I think that remains largely to be seen, whether we've arrived at this full point of fusion or whether we're still heading there. But I do think what we have to consider is, do we want to do that? Do we want to live in a hybrid reality? Because I think the worst thing is if we just end up there without really realizing it. And this again speaks to this idea of we are being deprived of our agency. We are deprived of actually making that decision as a whole, because it impacts all of us, but actually we are not the ones who are leading these decisions. And I think I want to talk a bit more about as well this idea of an intermediary and material, because I did mention that earlier that we don't really get to work with the raw material. We have something provided for us, and therefore we don't get to experience this. And it's important to understand that there is different levels of access that we have to that material. And there are obviously different kinds of people, such as hackers, such as coders, who understand it better. And I like to think, for example, of hackers like poets, because in a way that a poet has to really understand a language in order to be able to subvert it, to play with it, to somehow misuse it. In the same way, a hacker needs to really understand what they're working with in order to find a different way to navigate it. And I really wonder, what would the world look like if we all had the same awareness and knowledge of the pure material of the internet as hackers do? Because we don't have internet education in schools, which to me is absolute nonsense. It's crazy, because it's no surprise that policymakers are still catching up with this rapidly developing thing that has encompassed all of our entire world. And we can see it has huge consequences in elections, social divisions, self-esteem, mental illnesses, and so on. And yet we don't have any structured internet education in schools to actually show people and teach, teenagers, young people, this is what the internet is. Play with it, experiment with it, understand how it works, understand what you are doing when you are using it. And that way, by having that understanding, it cannot be used against you, because you are aware that you are being manipulated. So therefore, you can start to circumvent it somehow. So I kind of lost track of what the original question was, but I hope that this in some way responded to it.
Yeah, it's very nice. You touched upon a very important topic of being of a problematic of not being able to create internet contents. Obviously, internet education is an important part of it. Obviously, you created some internet territories. Your work, Jungte.net, is a very good example of that. So you're actually like practicing being active creator in the internet. I wonder what does it take to be an active creator of the internet? How had you made this Jungte platform? What were the challenges by working with this project?
So me and Iga, we prototyped the whole platform, and we worked with a programmer, coder, Thomas Martinkos, who was really great. He really helped us in shaping our kind of crazy and strange ideas into what was possible within the budget and within the available technology. So he was a really great collaborator in this, but we had to learn how to prototype and how that works and how that looks. And that was really great because, again, we started to understand, how does this function? How does this work? What does the website look like behind the face? What does the code behind it look like? And that's also what we try to do on the platform. We try to make it so the live code is always visible in the background, and it's changing as you are interacting with it. And it's this kind of way to kind of remove this image or this face from the website itself. And what we try to do with our work in digital spaces and the internet is really allow it to be a collaborator, the internet itself, to allow the presence of the digital to be in our work, to have its own agency. So Kitas, could you please show the Jungte experiment number 4 example? So this was our 4th experiment in which we developed this stethoscope microphone, which allowed us to broadcast the sounds from within our bodies. And Jungte is both a project where we conduct workshops for people and also where we have performances where it's just the two of us and we're using digital means to connect. So in this way, we were trying to sit facing each other with our set of speakers and our stethoscope microphone and offer the sounds of a part of our body to each other, and the other person would choose a part of their body to receive it with. And it was this kind of exchange happening that was live streamed on Facebook, and the viewer was in the middle. We had this microphone which was recording the meeting of our waves. And what was really strange is that around the time when we really started to work on the platform, our computer started glitching in really strange ways, really strange ways. And at the end of this performance, we were aligning our heartbeats, and for some reason, it just cut out. And every person that we spoke to who was watching had a slightly different story. Oh, I got this message. Oh, my phone switched off. And it was really strange for us to hear that, there was some kind of broader glitching happening. Of course, this is just wishful thinking that somehow, we influenced this presence. But for us, it was so amazing to see that actually we didn't make this decision to end it there. It was decided for us by the digital. So this is just an example of how we very much invite and try to allow it to be part of our work and have its own space, because it's there with us, it's dancing with us, it's not just us two, and we have to learn how to navigate with it. So that would be kind of my advice for people who are trying to get into this, is really understand the material that you're working with, spend time with them, get to know them. The first example on the Jungte.net platform is exactly that, encountering the digital, actually, encountering the digital physically with your body. Before you can connect to other people, you need to connect with this other presence that is always there.
Okay, and maybe the very last question is about very practical thing. Well, your platform, Jungte.net, is a certain body of art, and it is situated within the wider body of the internet. Bodies need maintenance. So what about maintenance of your online work? It's quite obvious. How do you maintain canvas as a body? But how do you maintain online platform?
So maintain can have a few different connotations. I mean, at the moment, the exercises which are there, and I guess we maintain the platform by paying the bill for the server. I think it's the equivalent of buying yourself food so you don't starve to death. But I guess we are sort of mothering this platform and buying it food by paying its bills. But when we think about the body of this platform, of course, it exists on a server. It's not just out in the cloud somewhere. And the Jungti project is still very much in its beginnings. We've been doing it for almost 2 years now, but there is so much more that we are looking to learn, to try, to experiment, to discover. And an idea which I had was to, at some point, move the Jungti platform on a dedicated server that would be powered by renewable energy, such as solar panels. And somehow finding a way that this platform can be reintegrated back into nature, and it can be online if there is sun, if it has energy, and offline until that time comes again. So this is again part of this breaking of the simulacrum of how we see the internet and actually bringing it very physically into our physical environment and specifically into nature, because this is kind of very much a solarpunk strategy, and solarpunk, for people who don't know, is a movement in speculative fiction that is trying to imagine a future beyond climate change in which we all haven't perished in an apocalypse, but actually we have managed to survive it and integrate nature with technology in sustainable ways. And it's very much based on rethinking how can we use what we have now, not wait for some future technology that hasn't been invented, but how can we use the internet differently? How can we use technologies which have been discarded or put to the side and reinvent them? How can we rethink the way that we use public space and so on? So it's very kind of DIY, very activist movement. And we are very much kind of thinking a lot along this in this way, because the internet has a huge ecological impact. And it requires maintenance, as you said, this kind of continual maintaining to infinity. But just like capitalism, it cannot go on forever without any consequences. We already see that Bitcoin is using the same amount of energy as the whole of the Netherlands. So there is a big question that we have to answer with how do we bring the internet back and break this image of it being always there, 24/7, always accessible, and actually accept a way of having a version of the internet which is maybe a more fragile, maybe not always available, and through that somehow find a new way to use it and a new way to interact with it. If you want to know more about solarpunk, I have recently co-edited and published a book called Regeneration and Its Discontents, available through 6chair Books, in which one author, Jay Springer, talks about solarpunk in the first chapter. So go and check it out. Shameless promo.
Nice, and I guess I have very good example on how actually big impact on the environment of the internet is, because we all know that, but until we get some kind of very kind of material expression of this, it's just like numbers somewhere. So just to finalize, as a final example, there is this project, 1000 clouds per second by Katarzyna Bodziak, made Stainforth and David Beiser. This is a project proposal and augmented reality artwork, which starts from the idea that apparently an average cloud has a volume of 32 cubic meters. Average cloud. Okay, whatever that means, 32 cubic meters. In 2020, global cloud computing processes managed to generate 2.1 gigatons of gas, of CO2. So when you start calculating, it seems that internet generates around 1,000 clouds of CO2 per second. So they're using this metaphor to get away from the cloud metaphor, and by using it as a symbolic tool to actually show how material the body of the internet is. So yeah, we touched upon a lot of various topics today, and it was very, very interesting. We're very thankful to you, Dovydas, for this elaboration which you presented. A lot of, this speech, the conversation was quite eclectic, going from one corner to the other, but that's the internet. We always being attacked with huge amount of information, which usually most of the time is totally very eclectic, like just, no kind of coherence in topics. So we had the idea of the body, and we touched it from the net.art. We saw how materiality of the internet can be manipulated, experimented. We saw how you can connect your body to another body through the internet, through Unity platform. We encourage everybody to use it, and actually it requires like multiple users at once, so I guess now it's the best time to try it out when there's a lot of people looking over it. And finally we checked how impactful the maintenance of the body of the artwork or the internet is. So a lot of topics, and they're really, really important. Thank you, Dovydas, for helping us to navigate this labyrinth. Thanks.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. And that's a great idea. Maybe we can all meet on jungte.net after this and try and experience it together.